am delighted to be here on this special occasion as we celebrate the legacy and trajectory of one of our most distinguished faculty members. We call the last lecture, not because it is truly the last, thankfully, nor because it is strictly a formal academic lecture, but because it offers a glimpse of the very best of the person we are honoring this afternoon, with perhaps a little more freedom and a little less footnoting. Today, I have the honor and privilege of introducing the Robert A. and Evelyn J. Ferris Professor Jean M. Bartunek, RSCJ. Professor Bartunek, along with Professor Judith Gordon, was among the first two tenure-track women hired into the Boston College School of Management in 1977. Her primary interests focus on academic practitioner relationships and organizational change. She has explored the many dimensions that connect theory, research, and practice, including collaborative research, the sharing of knowledge across boundaries, and relationships that transcend traditional research contexts. In addition, she has studied the complex processes of organizational change, especially the relationships between change agents and recipients, and the interactions within and across these groups. Now, is she as complex as her research suggests? We are about to find out. So please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Jean Bartunek, our 2026 last lecturer.
Thanks very, very much, Tomeo. It's a huge honor to be invited to do this, and your introduction is extremely generous. So thank you. A couple of friends in my department, Ben Rogers and Mike Pratt, pointed out that it was snowing this morning when we woke up. So maybe God does have a bit of a sense of humor, although I have a feeling God has some other more important worldwide events to deal with today. So we can keep many people in mind while we're here and afterwards in many parts of the globe. I am going to try, I was here a couple weeks ago at an event and I noticed that people weren't right in front of the microphone. You couldn't hear them well. So if anybody at any point can't hear me, just please let me know. Okay. Oops, that I didn't expect to happen. Okay, let's see. Sorry, I'm not used to working with this getup. I'm going to give some preliminary introduction to the presentation first. And so the first thing I want to do is thank Bob and Evie Ferris, who funded my chair for the past 20 years plus, and who have made a huge difference in my life and the life of many of the people, especially doctoral students with whom I've been privileged to work. And I want to mention where the talk title comes from. There is a journal published by the European Group for Organization Studies that's called Organization Studies, and it used to have a section called Vita Contemplativa, in which they invited some faculty members around the world to write article-length biographies. So I wrote one that was published 20 years ago, and in fact, they stopped this section right after I wrote mine. I'm not sure how I should take it, but I think it's probably not for the better. So, but at any rate, that a lot has happened in the last 20 years. So, I also want to mention, if you see any name in red on a slide, especially if the name is Meg Guider, who is there but has to go teach a class at 12:30, Nancy Keogh, where are you, Nancy? Marianne Lockery, who's in Australia, unfortunately, or Susan Regan, who's right here. They're members of the community in which I'm living right now, and to which I owe a lot. So, Britton told me this morning she wasn't sure how, or not this morning, like within the last half hour, that she wasn't sure how a Christmas gift went with dialectics, right? But we'll see. So I am aware that this is a topic to which there are a lot of approaches. One of my friends in Los Angeles told me a lot about Hegel and the sweep of history, and I'm not going to talk about that. Ligita, who lives next door, where are you? Told me about Bernard Lonergan's approach to conversion processes, and I don't think I'm talking about that. I'm going to talk about a very core, central for me idea, which is that we often experience apparent oppositional tensions. One example is, do I want stability or change in my life? So we can see a question like this as offering us either or choices, separate choices on different occasions, and or fostering both and understandings. For example, either or is stability is good and change is bad, or vice versa. Separation, under some circumstances stability is good, under other circumstances change is good. Both and stability and change aren't in opposition at all, they can foster each other. And how we experience such options often evolves over time. So today I want to focus on just a few dualities during my adult life, between my academic and religious life, and between theory, research, and teaching, which I'm putting in one place, and practice, which means the practice of doing something in my academic life. And I will say that I'm only going to discuss some dualities that have turned out well. You don't need to know about the others. So I'm also going to, so I don't have to talk about these specifically all the time, I'm also going to use some symbols for the components of these dualities that I will put at the bottom of slides when I'm talking about any one or more of them. One is for my academic life, one is for my religious life, and one is for practice. Practice often involves administrative practice. So, and in the presentation of the slides, I'll just show the components that seem most salient to that topic. Okay, and here's an outline from here on. I was giving preliminaries. I'm going to talk about precursors of the Christmas gift, the gift itself, and then the aftermath in 8 different vignettes. Okay. So that was on the first day of kindergarten, I decided I wanted to be a teacher. What grade I most wanted to teach kept going up all the time until it got to doctoral students, and then that was fine. And I also discovered over time that I love academic scholarship, and that's a core component of what my kindergarten understanding of teaching includes. So on my first day of first grade, I decided I wanted to be a Catholic sister. Isn't it nice when all your life decisions are made by the time you're 6 years old? And the desire was strengthened in high school at the Academy of the Sacred Heart in Cincinnati, and in college at Maryville College of the Sacred Heart in St. Louis, where I majored in psychology and sociology. My college is now a secular university, but there are 5 members of my order, including me, who are on the board. After college in 1966, I became a member of the society in Albany, New York, with the understanding that is not the typical understanding that I was also going to get a doctorate in social psychology. You're not supposed to say something like that. But I did, and not only that, but it was agreed that this would happen before my college GRE scores were no longer good. So my first job after I got out of the noviceship involved teaching at a Sacred Heart school in the Chicago area. And that's at a time when what's called organization development was emerging as a planned organization change method that was designed based on the social sciences to develop means in which members of an organization can foster beneficial collaboration, can have much more participation in decision-making, and generally be more effective. But the organization development intervention at our school was a disaster. I'll just say briefly that the consultants who led it were fired. 3 faculty members quit just before they would have been fired. And for the rest of you, all of us, me included, wanted absolutely nothing to do with anything participatory at all. We were all in favor of the most hierarchical hierarchy there could be. So this was kind of a motivator for my graduate studies. There ought to be ways to do this better. My doctoral program was at social and organizational psychology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. This was a picture of Chris Keyes, who was my advisor. You can see in the picture a little hint of how UIC was designed by Walter Netsch, who designed it using a brutalist style, and in fact saw it as the crowning glory of brutalist architecture, which I'm afraid it is. So you can understand why it was kind of nice to come here, just to be in this place. So I was all intent on becoming a nun, going to graduate school, but I sort of forgotten about having to get a job until the end of February of my last year. So there's a small regional convention called the Midwestern Psychological Association that was meeting in May, where schools who were desperate were looking for people, and people who were desperate were looking for schools. So a guy named Keith Murnion, who was then an assistant professor in the organizational behavior group at the University of Illinois, who needed to replace a visitor all of a sudden, came up to the convention, interviewed me for 20 minutes, and then a week later they offered me a visiting job and told me I could interview if I wanted, but I didn't have to. But I had had an actual interview at a university that had croaked when they saw I was a nun, even though they knew that. So, all right, I have no idea what I'm doing. There are all kinds of stories about nuns getting jobs in fields for which they haven't been trained, but this wasn't the way it was supposed to go. But the year in Urbana-Champaign was transformational for me. First of all, Mike Mock had just been hired into a tenure-track job at Illinois with a contract to evaluate a quality of work-life program at a company we called FoodCom. Quality of work-life programs were a substantial development of organization development. They were jointly managed, they were participative efforts, typically negotiated between labor and management with the idea that they would foster both productivity and employee dignity and better circumstances. While this was going on, I was reading a book that was popular at the time by Chris Argyris and Donald Chern called Theory in Practice. And organization development, because it was taking social science theories and implementing them in practice, was an example of theory and practice. And it was, at least when it was done better than had been my experience. So I also had a dilemma. I had a one-year job. Do I want to make final vows? What do I want to do for a career when I'm in a business school, whatever that is? And on December 25th, 1976, my father and I were visiting my brother Bob in the Kansas City area because my mom had died the year before. So my dad and I went to Kansas City to spend that time with Bob. And I was staying at a Best Western hotel, and I got this unexpected Christmas gift. On Christmas morning, I was praying with the prologue of the Gospel of John. Anybody here who teaches theology, turn off anything you know. Okay. And I was reading this stuff. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and so forth. I was thinking, how boring. And this is awful. this is this super powerful God telling us what to do from some distance away. And why in the world would I care about that? But then there's a whole bunch of other stuff in the prologue, and it gets to a point where it says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And all of a sudden I thought, this is theory and practice. This is some distant God actually doing something, actually being with us. That's a theologian leading the laughing, I want you to know. And I thought, wow, this isn't bad. I can make my final vows now. And I want to know I know what I want to do for my career. So, that's not bad for a Christmas gift. So the obvious next step when something happens like that is come with Judy Gordon to BC. Judy, could you stand up just for a second so everybody sees? We were the first 2 tenure-track women in the School of Management. And this is a picture of our department. This was taken in Judy's backyard in 1978. And I would just like to mention one thing. I won't introduce everybody in the department. Judy and I looked then just like we do now, obviously. When you decide to make your final vows in my order, you're supposed to have an extensive preparation period, taking at the very least several months. But I'd just gotten this new job, so the timing pretty much sucked. So I raised the question with Ed Hughes, who was the department chair, what do I do? And he gave me advice that I think is useful for all of us to still hear. You're assuming that the only options open to you are those that have been offered. And you don't have to assume that. That's something worth remembering that was a huge help. So what I did was, I went back to Chicago to make my final vows the next year, and then I went to prepare 2 years later. And Chris did one of the readings at the Mass for it, and Keith and Mike were both able to be there. And so was Dal Fisher from my department at BC, which was really nice. Okay, now the aftermath, the vignettes. Number 1 is, how do I make theoretical sense of this Christmas gift? Actually, this happened certainly on Christmas morning. I wasn't thinking theoretically. I was at a conference in Baltimore, and I was visiting with my brother Tom afterwards, and it was while I was talking with him that it suddenly occurred to me that what I was talking about was dialectical processes, whatever those were. I didn't have to know details like that. So I want to give 2 examples of theorizing about change in terms of dialectical processes. Here is one from a paper published in 1984. My religious order had been through a lot of change after Vatican II, and among other things was merging its 5 provinces in this country into one. One of the changes that have been going on was there were a lot of disagreements and disputes between people who had been working in Sacred Heart education using the model that had been developed a long time ago, and people who were newly involved in things like civil rights, things that we would now put under the generic term of justice. And that disagreement and how it was carried out was intimately involved in the decision about the structuring. And one of the things I learned from that, learning it in part from a workshop that Judy and I did with the leaders of the provinces, was they were very good at holding both sides of that dilemma. They didn't take just one side. Example 2. I mentioned that Mike and I were studying a quality of work-life intervention at a company we called FoodCom. These projects were, one of their fundamental aims was, how do you increase respect between managers, top managers, middle managers, so forth, and employees? And here's one of the things we learned. Respect meant very different things to each of the groups that were there. For some of the lower level employees, for example, it meant getting adequate lighting in the parking lot so nobody would try to steal from them as they left their job. For a lot of managers, it meant you're going to be much more productive. For corporate level management, we're going to make more money. Oh, and you're going to be happy. One of the things we learned was that the consultants were totally oblivious to the fact that that all the people there understood respect totally differently. They just assumed respect is you respect each other. So they didn't understand it when all the great things they tried didn't work. So that was a really useful learning about roles of dialectics. Number one, are they done well? Number two, are they not even noticed when they should be? So like any good scholar, I decided I should go conduct another study and explore what this means. So I became aware of a change process that was going to take place in a school. And just for Kathleen's sake and anybody else who might be from the Cleveland area, this was not the school. This is the now defunct Home and Dominican High School at Chicory in Cleveland, Ohio. But I decided, okay, great. I have got to go study this and explore the ideas more. So I explored a change that was taking place in a school. I'd gotten permission to do it. The principal was totally enthusiastic that I was going to explore this change process in the school using paying attention to dialectical processes. And I will say, skipping way ahead, this was a successful study by many academic criteria. In particular, it led to Debbie Kolb and me editing a book on hidden conflict in organizations. But after 1 year of doing the study, the principal kicked me out. How could that be? I'm this wonderful person. And look at my theoretical foundation for this study. Strangely, she didn't care about the theoretical foundation. So after that sequence of events, after that, there was a sequence of events. I'm going to mention 3 events. I had a dream. I dreamed that I was going to the school. I was looking for a parking place near it so I could talk to the principal about returning. I saw this big sign, "The Mission," posted all over the school. So I said to the principal, I had this dream about the mission. And she said, I don't care. You're not coming back. Second, Merrill Lewis moved to Boston. Merrill had been the first tenure-track woman hired in the organizational behavior group in Illinois, so we'd known each other a little. And she and Roger Everett, whom she'd met there, had gotten married and had moved together to the Naval Postgraduate School in California. There they had discovered that the questions that had arisen for them as new faculty members were radically different from the questions that we ordinarily studied from a scholarly perspective. So they'd, like if any of you are new this year, I'm sure you've had some questions about how BC functions that don't belong in any academic journal. So at any rate, they'd gotten divorced. Roger had stayed out in California. Merrill had moved to Boston, where we connected as friends. Third, I had a chance encounter with Catherine Lacey, who was a friend of mine who was then a doctoral student at the Harvard Ed School, who was starting a new teacher empowerment group at a network of schools that became the Network Faculty Development Committee, and was interested in studying how it went. First, she thought, I can do this for my dissertation. You could be on my dissertation committee. And her faculty told her, no. So then I started thinking, gee, maybe based on what Merrill had developed, we can do this as a joint project. So it's not just me telling the story of what happens in this group, but it's it's me and the insiders telling the story. So she said that would be okay if it was okay with Diane Wood, who was starting the group with her. And that ended up being a very meaningful experience for me. I ended up sitting in on all of the group's meetings for 7 years, longer than either Catherine or Diane were there. And these are just a few of the articles that were written from that experience. I just want a few articles, plus I ended up writing a book, Organizational and Educational Change, the Life and Role of a Change Agent Group, in which I invited anybody who had ever been a member of the NFDC to write their own chapter, and many of them did. And Diane wrote one about implications for the NFDC's work for educational policy, for example. And the two of them together wrote Reflections. So this ended up feeling, this is much better. It led to a book Meryl and I co-authored that has been fairly influential about thinking about how academics can collaborate with members of a setting to study it. And it also led to a bunch of other insider-outsider studies, one of which I just want to mention has to do, that Simona Georgi, Meg Geider, and me was on what happened in the context of the apostolic visitation of U.S. women religious. Okay, vignette 4. How many of you were here in the late 1980s? So a few of you remember an incredibly creative strategic planning process that took place then. A few of you. And first of all, I want to say thank you to the BC archivists for this picture. They encouraged lots of faculty members to get involved in doing the strategic planning. And one of the things that came out of that was that in the School of Management, the finance department and our department each decided to start PhD programs. Theirs started, I think, in 1991, and ours started in 1992. And that has been, for me at least, and I think for many other people in my department, really important, a crucial part of our experience here. So what I want to do, just to honor that, is to quickly show pictures that include all of the people who've gotten doctorates from our department. I'll just mention their first names to honor them. Massimo, Andrea, Ben, Jacob, Bob, Brad, Benjamin, Camille, Callan, Elise, Chelsea, Chet, Christy, Dana, Boram, who's here, Inga, Lily, Bess, who's here too, Greg, Eric, Liz, Felipe, Gabriel, Erica, Hamza, Dan, Luke, Hillary, Je, who was Alex when he was here, Beth, Ian, Ivan, Joy, Jamie, Lake Jagu, Jennifer, Joel, Jenny, John. John, incidentally, was my first PhD student. Jen, Lakshmi, Karen, Ju Young, Kate, Kenny, Laura, John, Kim, Lee, Ryan, Liz, Lydia, Mamta, Mark, Doug, Mary, Wendy, Mugu, Ray, Paisley, Peter, Mina, Najung, Raoult, Erica, Steph, Isabel, Taehyun, Tammy, Jordy, Steve, Wei, Rich, Chris, Ron, Rick, and Sharon, who have immeasurably really improved the quality of life. And this is just a chance to thank Nancy Keogh for hosting so many of our honor students at our community holiday meals. And of course, the best group yet is all the Shannon, Mara, Tim, Angela, Tuo, Nitin, Letitia, Katie, Mary, and Poonam. Thank you all for making this adventure much more fun. Okay, a practice dilemma. where I actually had to do some administration. So as a side note to all those who are administrators here, thank you for your service. The question is, I was nominated to run for president of Academy Management. Should I do it? And I ended up doing it. I ended up winning. And this is a brief excerpt from my presidential address. I mentioned dreams before, and this is another example. In December of 1997, Mike Hitt, who was then past president of the Academy of Management, and thus in charge of the nominations process for positions on the Board of Governors, called me to tell me that I'd been nominated to run for president and invite me to run. I told him I'd make a decision about whether or not to accept the nomination by having a dream about it and working with the dream and seeing how the dream came out. Susan Regan took many of the photos that I ended up using in my presidential address. So I dreamed that I went shopping for shoes with Deborah Ancona, who is the Seeley Distinguished Professor of Management at MIT. And the shoe store we were going to was on the roof of a tall apartment building. I was sure the shoe store would not have any shoes that were my size, but somewhat to my surprise, they did have some, though they were ugly. So I worked with the dream the next morning, and it soon became evident that there was a metaphor. The shoe fit, even if it was ugly. And that was enough to decide to accept the nomination. But it seemed to me there was more to the dream than that one metaphor. And I'm only telling you a small part of the dream and a small part of what I did with it, but that's plenty. So you're not supposed to go shopping for shoes on the top of an apartment building. This is totally paradoxical. Shoes symbolize something very earthy and grounded and real, like practice. The top of a tall apartment building way up in the stratosphere is kind of an ethereal theory world. We don't go way up into the stratosphere to do something in the real world. But that's where the real world was to be found. So this was a learning for me. Maybe research versus practice and its related dichotomies can be better thought of as tensions and dualities we all have in common, but that we express in different ways. This does not mean that theorists ought to abandon theorizing for awful practice, or that practitioners should abandon theirs for sloppy theorizing. It does mean developing an appreciation that whatever work we undertake, we do within the context of the dilemmas and tensions we all share, and to the understanding of which all of our work can contribute. So, this ended up being really important for me. This dream led me to see something that I wouldn't have ordinarily seen that was directly related to the Christmas gift. Practice dilemma 2. I will say I'm not going to talk about it, but there was one point when I was Dean of the Fellows of the Academy of Management when Andy Boynton, our dean, came to my aid and enabled Ed Taylor to do some very important stuff, accounting work for us. So we always have a fellows dinner at the Academy. That's one of the, I don't think that's true of all professional associations, but ours always is. The fellows dinner is really important. We recognize new fellows, we recognize awards received, enjoy our time with each other, and it has sacred components. For example, what would Passover be without a Seder meal? And so, but what happens when we can't have a fellows dinner because of COVID, because we can't go anywhere? So I thought, this is so important. We have to do something about sharing food. So I tried to contact the restaurant. The meeting was supposed to be in Vancouver that year, and said, all the money we gave as a down payment, why don't you give that away to somebody? And they said, not a good idea. And I tried to call Tim Hortons and said, why don't you give some donuts to somebody? I couldn't get through to them at all, understandably. Fortunately, and this is a side, it helps to have friends. I eventually remembered that Dave Wetton, who's a friend of mine, who when he had retired from BYU, he wasn't sure what he would do after retirement, so he talked with Rick Maude, who had retired from the University of Oregon, about what to do after retirement. And Rick had said he really enjoyed volunteering at his congregational church. So, okay, well, I contacted Rick, hoping he knew something about food. Did he have any ideas of what to do? Because mine were dumb. And this is what he ended up doing when he introduced the Zoom Fellows Dinner. In lieu of the meal, I'd like to invite anyone who would like to make a donation to their local food bank. And my wife and I, as an incentive, will match your donations with a $1,000 contribution to our local food bank, which was Food for Lane County in Eugene. And we ended up raising $10,000 to contribute. Rick did a great job. And I dyed my hair purple after that. Occasionally, I get a confirmation that something right is going on in this process of tensions. Last spring, I developed a really serious back problem that meant I had to have back surgery in July, so I wasn't going anywhere. But I got a note from the International Society for Organization Development and Change that was going to be having their conference in Connecticut, that they would like me to come give. I had gotten a note from them. They'd like me to come give a talk and get an award for them, which I wasn't able to do. I recorded a thank you for them. So notice that this organization development was what got me started, because it was such a bad experience. But obviously there are people who do it much better. This was their award for me, which was really affirming of the links. They talked about the articles I published and the what they call foundational books I'd written, and talked about how I've continually pushed our field forward through research, thought leadership, and service, which was really kind of them. And then they did something that I've never seen happen at a professional conference before. I mean, nuns are supposed to pray for somebody else. People at a professional conference aren't supposed to pray for the nuns. So this was part of their prayer for me, which was really, really touching for me. Okay, one more important vignette, because, I mean, this was putting it all together, but this stuff keeps moving. So, my interest has been how academics and practitioners can collaborate, but a lot of the contemporary emphasis has been on academic impact, which focuses on what academics do that's good for the world. And some of this is due to the British government developing a research excellence framework in which they measure impact in each unit of each university. Some of it is due to the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, because some universities want their faculty to say which goal they're working on. But I think a lot of this emphasis is really dumb. I think sometimes it's people doing things that really matter, and academics can think about how we can help the other people doing things, rather than just start with our initiative. Maybe we can be in supporting roles. Absolutely. There is an Oscar for Best Actor in a supporting role. What about if it were Oscar for Best Researcher in a supporting role? And I want to thank Marianne Lockery in my community for her helpful suggestions on this. So we ended up with 6 nominees that are all very, very important for this additional nominees. James Seltzer and Lindsay Carfield Seltzer for their work to educate rehabilitation researchers. Denise Rousseau for her research and theorizing inspired by her father's awful employment experience. Multiple researchers for their evaluations of Dolly Parton's Imagination Library. Ann Burgess for her contributions to the Behavioral Science Unit of the FBI. Timothy Neal for his research illuminating and propagating Australian Indigenous approaches to fire management. Hans Hansen for his contributions to reducing the use of the death penalty in Texas, which he did in part by using narrative theory. But, Anne, could you please stand? We have one particularly exemplary example here. Ann Burgess in our Canal School of Nursing. Okay, at least let everybody, yeah. This is some from the BC website about her, but I just want to say, she came to BC before Judy and I did. Amazing. Admittedly, she took a few years off and drove to Pennsylvania sometimes during the week, but she's been back for quite a while. She started doing work with Linda Holmstrom in our sociology department. That was going on when Judy and I got here. And about the experience of victims of rape, of trauma, and other kinds of abuse. So, sorry, wait a second. She had done really substantial and important work on that. In the early 1990s, the newly formed Behavioral Science Unit of the FBI was trying to figure out how they could interview criminals so they could figure out who was likely to be a serial killer, for example, or who was likely to murder somebody. I know I'm not saying that right, but they interviewed some of the people who were in jail, and they made up some questions to ask them, and they conducted the interviews, and they recorded the interviews, but then they realized they didn't quite know what to do with all that they had done. So they had heard about Ann's work, and so they contacted her. And to put it very briefly, she taught them how to design interviews. She taught them how to conduct interviews in ways that gathered a lot of knowledge and was safe. She taught them how to analyze the interviews and how to make sense of them. And that contributed to really important work, findings of the FBI. And incidentally, if you want to learn more by yourself, Hulu prepared a series on her a couple of years ago called Mastermind to Think Like a Killer. So if you want to learn more yourself. But I don't know about you, but I think that Anne is really worthy of an Oscar for Best Researcher in a supporting role, don't you? So, to conclude, but to continue, I think I've tried to give you a brief indication of how this stuff with theory and practice has kept evolving for me. It's a Christmas gift that has kept evolving. It's not just one thing you get in a box and put away. So I've learned through my career since the arrival of the Christmas gift the value of experiencing apparent dilemmas as ways that different aspects of them can enrich each other, and how their underlying meanings can keep unfolding over time in generative ways, often through the help of somebody else. So I feel very lucky to have had the Christmas gift and its underlying meanings unfold over the course of my career at BC, and indeed to have shared this career with Judy and our department. And speaking of evolution, this is our department today. It looks a bit different than it looked in 1977. I love being part of our department. I love the chance to have been at BC all these years. And thank you to all of you for your attention. Mm-hmm.
So that is for you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
So we don't have questions and answers for this last lecture. What we have is the opportunity to go directly to her, to thank her, to talk to her, and also there is some dessert also outside, okay? So thank you for coming and have a good day. Thank you.